Well, my name's Josh Patterson. I'm a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. We've got 81 people on board tonight for the next hour. It'll be an adventure, and we're glad to have you with us as we talk about the Enbridge decision. The first thing, So the first thing that we're going to talk about tonight is the Joint Review Panel, just to give everyone a little bit of a background on the Joint Review Panel itself. You might have been hearing a fair bit about the Joint Review Panel if you've been following the news or things online at all today. The Joint Review Panel was appointed by the federal government to review the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline proposal. It's called a Joint Review Panel because it's actually a combined body between the National Energy Board and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. There are 3 members of the National Energy Board, which is based in Calgary, who are the decision makers that will conduct the hearings. And they are kind of like judges in all of this. One of them is a biologist, another one I believe is a lawyer, another one was a geologist. 2 are from Alberta and 1 is from Ontario. The panel's job is to consider the issues that are set out in its terms of reference. Specifically, the things that they're going to do are to examine the environmental effects of the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline project. They're going to consider whether or not there are any technically or economically feasible measures to reduce some of those negative environmental effects, if any are found. They're going to consider comments from the public as well as evidence brought to them by Aboriginal peoples. They are going to provide a bunch of different ways for people to get involved, and one of those ways is through these community hearings that all of you have signed up for. And at the end of their process, they're going to submit a report to the federal government with recommendations about the project. They'll make the recommendation to the federal government about whether to approve or reject the project and what conditions, if any, to put on that approval. If the panel recommends approving the project, and I should point out that while the panel obviously can make a decision one way or the other, in many of these types of decisions, the National Energy Board or Canadian environmental assessment processes have tended to approve. So if they recommend approval, then the federal cabinet will consider their report, and the Joint Review Panel will ultimately issue what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, which is the approval, or one of the approvals that's needed for Enbridge. There's going to be a few phases of the Joint Review Panel community hearings. The first phase starts tomorrow, and that's why there's so much media interest in all this right now. The first phase is for intervenors. Now, intervenors is a legal word that we use for basically full participants in the review process. These are groups like First Nations, municipal and provincial, as well as federal government organizations, other organizations who are basically participating throughout the whole kit and caboodle of the process. Intervenors have the right to bring evidence, they have the right to ask questions, they have the right to fully participate just as much as Enbridge, in fact. And they'll be using this first phase to present their oral evidence. In the second phase, that's where individuals like you will have your opportunity to speak your mind to the Joint Review Panel in a 10-minute oral statement. This is currently scheduled to start in March, but that schedule could change depending on how the first phase goes. Those hearings will likely be in a community near you, and we hope that they'll be scheduled in a way that's convenient, whether on work days, evenings, or weekends, to accommodate people. It's likely that they're going to send you a scheduled time to appear at the panel. Now, the panel proceeding is very much like a court in a lot of ways. These 3 members of the panel are, in fact, they have the powers of judges. But the community hearings that you will be attending will be a little less formal than a court. You still have to tell the truth. Of course, we know that you won't do anything other than that. But it's going to be kind of court-like. It's going to be a little bit different than any probably than many kinds of public speaking opportunities that you might have had before if you have had those experiences. If you have anything written that you want to show the panel, like a written document or something that you're going to be referring to, it's best to ask for guidance from staff beforehand, and I would make sure that I come armed with some photocopies of anything that I'm planning on referring to or showing, so that you can give copies to the panel as well as to Enbridge. If you have a PowerPoint presentation or something like that that you know you want to provide beforehand, or that you know you want to show, you do need to ask the panel's permission ahead of time, and you can do that by contacting the process advisor, which is a team that the National Energy Board has set up to help you with these kinds of procedural things. The numbers and the email are on your screen. Don't feel like you need to be an expert. As Eric and Jolyn are going to talk to you a little bit more about this, that really, there are all kinds of people who are going to be there as paid experts to give their views. All you need to do is to be yourself and tell them what you think and what you feel, what your concerns are about the Enbridge pipeline and tanker project. For many, speaking at the panel could be nerve-wracking, but there really is no reason to have any fear. They have an obligation to hear from you. That's what this whole process is for. And all you need to do is express your views about the project, whether you have views against the project, for the project, or whether you're neutral. You have a right to have your say. Remember that you can talk about any part of the project or its impacts that you want, whether environmental, cultural, or economic, or anything else. If you do go off topic in what as far as the board is concerned, or the panel is concerned, they may gently ask you to steer yourself back onto topic. Don't be intimidated by their questions or if they interrupt you. Just take it in stride, and you haven't done anything wrong, and just carry on. Say what it is that you need to say. Some people have asked questions of us, do I need to use the whole 10 minutes? No, of course you don't need to use the whole 10 minutes. You can feel free to take up as much of the 10 minutes as you like. If you're more comfortable saying something for a shorter period of time, by all means, you can do that as well. So if you do have any questions on any of these sort of procedural aspects, please don't hesitate to ask them, and we'll hopefully be able to get to them all before the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Eric.
Good evening, everybody. Presenters, can you hear my screen? Is it looking okay?
I can hear your screen.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, looks good.
So you can hear my screen? Okay. So we've entitled tonight's webinar, Our Coast, Our Decision. And media are piling into Kitimat for the start of the first phase of hearings, as Josh mentioned, those for the official intervenors, people who are actually providing evidence, which isn't the majority of folks on this webinar and isn't the majority of people who have signed up to participate. And those media and the broader politicians are asking the question of what do these community hearings mean as far as the overall proposal to bring oil pipelines and supertankers to our coast. And there are several ways to answer that question, but there will be probably maybe one dominant frame we call hearings, and we hope it's this one, that our coast and our rivers really, as British Columbians, as First Nations, as non-First Nations, and as Canadians, it should be the future of those should be our decision. Over the past few years, the overriding concern of this proposal has been the threat of oil spills, both into the rivers, the Great Salmon rivers of BC, and onto coasts from the proposed oil supertankers. And this risk of oil spills dominates much debate and is certainly one of the preeminent concerns of many people who have spoken up so far. The fundamental question, we think, as far as the political context goes, is do we as British Columbians and Canadians accept any level of risk of a catastrophic oil spill gibbets of this project. Others will be throwing out oil spills to occur, but we all know that accident will forever happen because humans make mistakes and machines will continue to break every now and then. And sometimes when an accident happens, it's pretty bad, like with the Exxon Valdez or with the BP spill, and all it takes is one incident, one accident, to mean lights out for lives and livelihoods. So the big question is, do we accept any level of risk at all? The second question I'm going to address is, who gets to decide the answer to that decision? Currently, federal regulators, informed by the joint review panel you will all be participating in, have been given authority to say yes or no to this project. No, they can say no to the project, and that's fairly definitive. But the federal government has the final authority to say yes. The most likely outcome from past pipeline hearings has been that the panel will say yes with conditions. For Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, a recent major pipeline proposal in Canada, about 115 conditions were given by that joint review panel in association with their recommendation of yes. And the federal government, Stephen Harper's government, then ignored the vast majority of those recommendations, over 100. So the federal government is within its power to ignore much of what the review panel for that pipeline and for this pipeline has to say. We think that our politicians should be taking a different stance, and that stance is that those most affected by this proposal, those local communities, those First Nations who are most affected, should get the say. And we have a principle of local control, which is that generally the people who live in a place should have the power to say no to proposals that threaten their lands and waters. And Josh will go over some of the decisions that have already been made in British Columbia authoritatively. And to us this means that the project should not go ahead unless these First Nations, unless local governments that live alongside First Nations and the province of British Columbia all decide to accept it. We feel that British Columbians bear the burden of risk, and we collectively have the say over this project. And although it is not our intent, nor will we ever tell any one of you what to say when you walk into that hearing room, whether for the project, against the project. We have one recommendation, that when you walk in there and you face that panel, you do so from a position of authority. You have a stake in this. Perhaps it is your local lands and waters that are being directly affected by the risk of a catastrophic oil spill. And it should be up to you and your neighbors and your community members and your local governments and your First Nation representatives decide. The trouble is that's not currently how it works, and that's not presently how Stephen Harper looks at things. So we need to be pretty assertive about that, both in the hearing rooms and if we're talking to the media, if we're writing letters to the editor. There is an attempt right now, a lot of media today and yesterday, to frame the overwhelming and courageous and laudable public participation in this process. Over 4,500 people have signed up to speak. There's an attempt to marginalize the right of those people to speak. Our Natural Resources Minister, Joe Oliver, is looking at ways to stop some of you from speaking. And he was talking about that today in the media, and that's not okay. We need to assert our ability to have our voices heard and to speak our minds, and we need to assert our ability to make this decision for ourselves as British Columbians and as Canadians. So if you're in BC, one thing, recommend walk in and assert some authority there. If you live outside of BC, much of the rhetoric around this proposal has been that it's somehow in the national interest. And the argument goes something like this. We have oil. We can sell it for some money. If we keep selling to the States, we might not make quite as much money as oil producers. So we need to ship it to China. So that must be in the national interest. And we beg to differ. You may beg to differ, maybe you agree, but if you live outside of BC, we recommend that you think about whether or not this project really is in the national interest, because there are impacts outside of BC on climate change and elsewhere. So perhaps take that into consideration. The Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, hasn't yet taken a position on this. We hear she's getting pressure from certain interests to support the project. We're doing what we can to make the argument that she should come out against. But when you go into those hearings, the media in British Columbia and in Canada are going to be listening, and perhaps Christy Clark will listen to the overwhelming voices coming to these hearings, and she'll come out against the proposal and stand up with the majority of British Columbians. With that, I'll pass it back over to Josh, and he can describe some of the First Nation decisions that have already been made.
Hi everyone, I'm back. So thank you very much, Eric. One of the things that Eric was highlighting is that this is really a decision that needs to be made here in British Columbia. And you might have been hearing a fair bit in the media lately about how this ought to be a decision for Canadians to make. And we agree that this is a decision that needs to be made by local people. An important thing for us to remember in talking about that, though, is that First Nations, and many of you may be First Nations who are on this call, First Nations to a large extent have already taken decisions about this pipeline and tankers project. And from the perspective of West Coast environmental law, and certainly the others who are presenting today, we think that it's really important that those decisions be recognized. There are over 130 First Nations in Western Canada who have stated their opposition to the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline and Tankers project. The map on the right here shows the nation's territories just in the province of British Columbia who have not only said no to the Enbridge project, but have gone a lot further than that. They have actually gone to the extent of banning tar sands pipelines and tankers from their traditional territories. Opposed First Nations who have declared such bans form an unbroken chain, as you can see, from the bottom of BC at the U.S. border all the way to the top, and from the Rocky Mountains along the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline route all the way out across the tanker route past Haida Gwaii. The position that First Nations have taken is that this project will violate their constitutionally protected Aboriginal title and rights, and that the Enbridge pipeline and tankers are against their Indigenous laws, their laws which continue to exist here today, even though obviously the Canadian and the BC governments are here too. There have been two major declarations against the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipelines and Tankers project. The one on the left here is the Coastal First Nations Declaration. It was passed in March 2010 by First Nations along the North Coast. And as you can see from the text there, it bans crude oil supertankers, tar sands pipelines through the entire, pretty much the entire Fraser River watershed, which is the main watershed right in the middle of the province. It's one of the world's most important salmon watersheds. And it also bans tankers on the north and on the south coast. You can see the wording here. It says that we will not allow the proposed Enbridge Northern Gateway pipelines or similar tar sands projects to cross our lands, territories, and watersheds, or the ocean migration routes of Fraser River salmon. And because Fraser River salmon migrate both through the ocean waters of the south coast and the north coast, the Save the Fraser Declaration is effectively a ban on tankers in both of those areas of the coast, as well as being a ban on oil sands pipelines through the Fraser watershed. First Nations laws have never gone away in British Columbia. In BC, First Nations have the right to make decisions about the use of their land and their waters according to their own laws. And this right is protected both under Canada's Constitution and under international law, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to which Canada is a signatory, as well as a whole bunch of other treaties that Canada is a party of. The Coastal First Nations Declaration and the Save the Fraser Declaration are First Nations law, and they permanently protect the coast and rivers from oil spills. So when we're talking about making a decision, and it being our decision, we need to recognize that there have been decisions already made here, and that those decisions are extremely important, not only for the government to recognize, respect, and consider, but also for the rest of us as British Columbians to recognize. And in fact, thousands of British Columbians have signed petitions supporting First Nations and recognizing that these declarations protect us all. So whether you're a supporter of the pipeline or an opponent, certainly these are some important facts that you need to consider as you're deciding to make, what to put in your submissions about this pipeline. Now I'm going to turn this back over to, well, not turn it back over, but I'm going to turn it over to Jolyn Bailey of ForestEthics.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to figure out if I can get my presentation to go full screen here. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about speaking from the heart, because even though we've discussed some of the problems with this review process, it really is an invaluable opportunity for British Columbians and people from Canada to go on record with our opinions about this project and whether or not it should go through. We need to do this so that the panel and everybody else that's watching this project knows where local people stand. And one of the most important ways that we can do this is to speak from the heart and to share our perspective and our truth with the panel. And there's a quote up there off the top from Frank Lloyd Wright. It says, "The truth is more important than the facts." And I put that up because I think it's a good kind of guiding principle for thinking about how to prepare for these hearings, is to really focus on your own truth. You're not expected to be an expert, and so the facts are less the focus here. This is really a way for the panel to take the province's pulse on this issue and find out where local people stand and what local people think about this project. So really want to encourage you to speak from the heart and share your truth with the panel. And there's a lot of reasons why that's important. One is that it really shows the depth of opposition to this project, and just how deeply people feel about it. It's pretty clear that there's a widespread opposition to this project in British Columbia, but what these hearings are an opportunity to highlight is really that this isn't an issue that we take lightly, that this is something that people feel really, really strongly about, and that's connected to things that matter deeply to us. It also highlights the complexity of the issue, so I think that there's a lot of different reasons why people take the positions they do on this project. It could be economic reasons, people worried about the way an oil spill would threaten the fishing industry, for example. There's people that are concerned about the environmental impacts of a spill in a salmon watershed, and the list goes on and on and on. But when we speak from the heart and we tell our own stories, it starts to show that this issue is definitely too complex for a simple rubber stamp answer. And the last one, speaking from the heart, makes what you say stand out. And I'm sorry for the spelling mistake there. I prepared this on the fly. But there's going to be, as we've heard, over 4,000 people expected to speak to the panel. And the more personal you can make your what you say to the panel, the more likely that it's going to be heard and remembered by people, because it'll stand out from the thousands of others. And sort of just in another way to think about why speaking from the heart is so important, I think, is just to think about a time in your life when you had your perspective changed or you were influenced by what somebody else said, and think about whether it was facts that you were hearing from them, or whether it was more of an argument where you started to see their perspective and where they were coming from. The truth is definitely for most people that we're influenced by these arguments that come from the heart, to a far greater degree than simple fact-based arguments. So I'm going to go through some different examples of what I mean when I say speaking from the heart. So one of the ways to speak from the heart is to make it personal and try and narrow down what it is that about this project that affects you personally, or what makes you feel connected to this issue. So an example of that is a friend of mine who grew up in Florida, and some people don't know this, but there's actually been a lot of smaller oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico prior to the the big BP spill that happened a couple years ago. And my friend remembers that when she went to the beach as a kid, she would usually end up getting tar balls stuck between her toes because there was oil that had just washed up and been in the sand. And she thought that was normal. And then when she came to BC, she was just totally overwhelmed by how clean our beaches were. And so for her, now this project is sort of potentially putting that at risk for her, and it's something that she's grown to really appreciate about British Columbia. So for her, that might be part of why this project means so much to her and stopping it. You can also speak from the heart by thinking about a place-based story that you can tell. So is there, have you been along the pipeline or tanker route? Is there a place that would be affected by this project that's special to you? Or in a different way, is there somewhere that might not be geographically related to this project but is related in some other way? An example of this, a simple one, my cousin was married on a beach that would be at risk of a tanker spill, so I think that's pretty clear why that would make my cousin concerned about this project. And in a different way, I grew up in a valley, it's not along the pipeline route, but it's been devastated by mountain pine beetle, which is related to climate change and essentially our fossil fuel addiction. So I've seen my home community, the ecosystem there, be devastated as a result of our addiction to fossil fuels. And so for me, part of what is important about my participation in this process is to do what I can to stop other communities from having to watch their landscape be destroyed by our reckless addiction to fossil fuels. And the last way that I want to talk about that is a powerful way to speak from the heart is just telling stories. So I'm going to tell you a quick story from my life to kind of illustrate the way that stories can be an effective way to speak from the heart and tell your story. So I actually grew up in Alberta, in Calgary. I was born there, and my family moved to BC when I was about 4 or 5. And I don't remember a whole lot from that time, but probably my most vivid memory was of a time when we went to go and see a salmon run. And so we all piled out of this minivan and walked to the river, and there was a bit of a current there. I remember it as something of a rapid, but I'm sure it wasn't actually. I was 5. And I probably didn't have a great idea of what it was exactly that we were doing, because I remember when I saw the first fish in the water, and it wasn't just in this rapid, it was actually swimming upstream, my jaw just dropped and I was totally flabbergasted. And this fish swimming upstream just seemed like such an incredible thing. And I think that's the moment when I really realized that British Columbia was a totally different place than Alberta. Growing up in the city in Calgary, I would have never imagined something like this, and suddenly I'm watching a salmon swimming upstream, and it was a totally magical experience for me, and it's part of the reason that I feel connected to British Columbia is that experience. My mom kind of was watching me standing there and wasn't saying anything, which was out of character for me, so she sort of walked over and nudged me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Joel, what do you think of all this?" And I was totally just in awe, and the only thing that I could say was, "Well, boy, those fish must have taken a lot of swimming lessons." But that really, it's a funny story, it's a cute story, but I think it really illustrates part of the reason why I feel so strongly about this issue, and why it's so important to me to go to these hearings and speak up. So I hope that that's a quick illustration of what I mean when I say speaking from the heart, and I hope that gives you a sense of why it's so important to go and speak your truth to this panel. We're going to transition towards questions now. So Jeanette's already gone over the 2 different ways you can ask questions.